Hi, my name is Bart, and in this video I am going to tell you how you can start keeping live plants in your aquarium. I'm just going to take some time to tell you what plants need to survive and how you can provide that for them in an easy way. So, starting off, it's very important what plants you are going to choose, because there are plants that have low requirements, but there are also plants that are pretty difficult to keep because they are quite picky in their environment. So at the end I'm going to cover some, I think I'm going to name 5, for example, 5 plants that you can start with that are very easy for you. But first you need to know what plants need to survive, because if you don't provide some basic needs for your plants, then even the easy plants will seem very difficult. Plants only need 3 things to grow, and that's not to survive, but that's really to grow like crazy, and that's lighting, nutrients, and carbon dioxide. That's what I call the plant pyramid, and I'm sure other people call it that as well, but that's the plant pyramid. At the top there's lighting, so we'll first talk a little bit about that. If you're a beginner, I would stay away from very bright lights for a couple of reasons. The first one is bright lights are expensive. I'm running pretty bright LED lights on my tank, but I didn't have them when I was a beginner, and that's fine. Another reason why I would stay away from bright lights is because you want to keep the plant triangle balanced, and if you've got bright lights, that also means you need to add a lot of nutrients and a lot of carbon dioxide in order to keep a balance within the plant triangle. So if you keep the light a little bit less bright, a little bit more dim, so low to medium lighting, that also means you have to provide low to medium nutrients and carbon dioxide. And the reason why that's preferable is because CO2 is quite expensive, and if you're a beginner and you just want to start keeping some live plants, you don't want to go out and buy an expensive CO2 set. The second thing on the plant triangle is nutrients, and it is true that fish provide some nutrients because they produce waste, they poop, and that's nutrients for your plants. However, unlike what I've seen and read a lot on the internet, just the nutrients produced by your fish is not enough for plants. It's not a complete diet, but it's also not enough. Certainly if you're keeping more than just a few plants. Instead of relying on your fish to produce enough nutrients for your plants to grow, make sure you buy a basic liquid fertilizer. And we'll get to other options of fertilization in a second, but make sure you buy a basic liquid fertilizer. I've got one. So this is my basic fertilizer. It's from a Dutch brand. It's very affordable, and you can dose your aquarium water with liquid fertilizer. Other options are a planted tank substrate, but that's not for beginners, and I'll explain why. Because a planted tank substrate is a way to add nutrients to the entire substrate of your aquarium, and that's very nice if you want to grow carpet plants, or if you've got a very high-tech aquarium and you want to provide a lot of nutrients through the roots of a plant. However, if you're just a beginner, you're probably only going to have a few plants, so the majority of your planted tank substrate won't be used. And the reason why that's a problem is because planted tank substrate, or aqua soil, aquarium soil, is very expensive. I remember starting out many years ago, and I read about a planted tank substrate, and I asked some people, and they said, is it mandatory? And the people I asked did recommend a planted tank substrate. So I did buy a small bag of planted tank substrate, and at this point, after many years, I can safely say that it's not worth it for me if you're not growing carpet plants. for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that it wears out over time, so after 1 or 2 years all the nutrients are gone and you need to remove the entire substrate and add in a new planted tank substrate if you want to keep it going. And another reason is if you pull out a plant that's rooted in planted tank substrate, your entire water will be murky and brown for the rest of the day. I wasn't a fan of it. And what you can do instead of a planted tank substrate is adding root tabs, or root tabs, and those are how do you call it? Those are tablets of nutrients that you push in the soil that contain a lot of nutrients. So it's a way to locally fertilize plants that are rooted. And remember, I will get to a couple of plant examples in the end. So that's the second thing. We've covered lighting, we've covered nutrients, and the third thing is carbon dioxide, or CO2. Now, plants need CO2. They just do. However, if you've got medium to low lighting and you provide some nutrients, then the CO2 that's in your aquarium can be enough if you are keeping the right plants. And the reason why I say it like this is because adding carbon dioxide to your aquarium is quite a step. As a beginner, I won't recommend immediately buying a CO2 set. All plants grow better if you inject CO2, but if you keep the plant triangle balanced by keeping lighting and nutrients low, then the carbon dioxide that's in your aquarium water, because there's always CO2 present due to gas exchange at the surface, then the CO2 will suffice. It's very important here that you're keeping slow growing plants. And the reason is that slow growing plants have lower requirements because they don't feel the need to grow very rapidly and explosively, and that means that they're not consuming a lot of nutrients and they're not consuming a lot of CO2. If you do want to add CO2, you're going to have to spend some money on buying cylinders of pressurized CO2. I'm actually using fire extinguishers on both of my tanks, but you're going to have to buy a couple of things. You have to buy the pressurized CO2, and you have to refill it once it runs out. You have to buy a regularizer, you have to buy a drop counter, you have to buy a diffuser in order for the CO2 to diffuse in the water. So those are all things that you need to buy, and once you've bought it, it's very affordable because the CO2 itself isn't very expensive. However, the equipment around it does cost quite some money. Now, before we jump into the plants, make sure you subscribe. No, just kidding. Oh, I'm not kidding. Do subscribe. Before we dive into the plants, we need to cover algae, because algae is going to be your biggest enemy if you're switching to live plants. And that's because it takes some time for an aquarium to be established, like 6 months or even a year, and then it's really established, and then it has found its balance, and that's the point where planted tanks really thrive. And up until that point, you're going to have to deal with some algae. Algae always grows because there's an imbalance in your aquarium, and that's also here we can also refer back to the planted tank triangle. So if you are providing a lot of nutrients and a lot of light, but you're not really keeping up with the carbon dioxide, then there's an imbalance in the triangle and algae will grow. And the same goes for a lack of nutrients, which is why you shouldn't rely on just your fish to provide nutrients, or a lack of lighting. And the type of algae can differ, but that's something for another video. Now, I think that you're ready to know what plants are suitable for beginners, because we've covered lighting, LED or fluorescent and keep it low. We've covered nutrients. I recommend liquid fertilizer because it's easy to dose and all plants are able to suck the nutrients straight from the water. And we've covered CO2. Don't inject it if you keep the other two to a minimum, and otherwise invest in injecting pressurized CO2. So now you're ready because you know what plants need. I'm going to recommend 5 plants from the top of my head. The first one is Java Fern. I've done an entire video on most of these plants, but Java Fern I'll link in the description. That corner, nice, I did it. So that's the first one. It's a very slow grower, and what you need to know is that it does have roots, but don't bury the roots in your substrate. Instead, stick the plant to a piece of wood or a piece of rock. It's a very simple plant, and most people say it's unkillable, but I have managed to kill some Java Fern, but it's going to be hard. So that's a good plant. If you think plants are expensive and you only want to buy just a few, a Java Fern should be on that list. The second one is Anubias. And even though I've got an Anubias plant right here that's struggling to survive due to a lot of blackbeard algae, I promise it's a very hardy plant. It's got thick green, almost leathery leaves, and it's just an amazing plant, very slow growing plant, which means the requirements are slim. Great plant for beginners. Then there is, what shall we do? Java moss. It's a moss. I've got some here as well. Also a little bit struggling due to algae, but overall moss grows in many circumstances. It grows in bright lights, low lights. It's also something that you stick to, for example, a piece of wood. Same goes for Anubias, by the way. I'm sorry. So it's a very great option. The fourth one is Vallisneria, and Vallisneria is a plant that I managed to grow as a beginner without too much problems, and that's why I'm recommending it to you. And I've kept Vallisneria ever since. This plant all the way here over here, this one, the very tall grassy one, is Vallisneria, and this plant is a plant that you do need to root in the substrate. And for this plant I recommend root tabs because I feel like it can be considered a root feeder. It's not 100% root feeder, it does consume nutrients from the water, but it's a great plant, and if you stick a root tab in there and replace that root tab every 3 months or so, then you're doing great. And it's a very beautiful plant. It will propagate in your aquarium, which is awesome to see. So it's a great plant. The last one, I am going to recommend something that's in here. Okay, I think I'm going to go with this plant over here. I think, yeah, this one you can see very clearly. This plant is called hornwort, or Brazilian, no, coontail. Coontail is, I think, a Canadian name for it. It's funny because these plants have all kind of different names. But this is a floating plant or a stem plant. So it relies almost 100% on nutrients in the water column. So don't bother with root tabs for this plant. And in theory you can just throw it in your tank and it will survive. But if you anchor it to something, for example by pushing something in the surface, or I don't know, tying it to a piece of wood, then it will grow. Are there other things that you need to be careful of when starting? Let me just give me a couple of seconds before you press away to think. Yeah, I want to tell you about stem plants. Stem plants, for example, this is a stem plant, this is a stem plant that I need to trim, this is also a stem plant that I need to trim, the tank needs maintenance. Stem plants are a lot of fun. You just push them in the substrate, they will grow, and if you want to propagate it, you just cut a piece off, take that piece, push it back in the substrate, and that piece will also grow. So it's a very fun plant. However, for most stem plants I do recommend either a little bit brighter lights and more CO2. And I think that was it. Make sure to subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate it. I'm trying to hit 1,000 subs, and maybe if you watch in the future, I already have it, I don't know. And leave a comment if you've got any questions. Up until now, I've answered all my comments on the channel. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Cheers.